Sometimes the most beautiful houses hide the darkest secrets. What you're about to hear is a story of betrayal, survival, and a shocking twist inside a quiet New England town. For privacy reasons, I've changed their names and locations, but every feeling, every detail, and every revelation is true. So lean in, listen closely, and follow this journey to the end. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our newest stories. Click like and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and share these unforgettable journeys together. The late November wind in Boston had a way of slicing through even the thickest wool coats. That afternoon, as I climbed the worn stone steps of St. Paul's Church on Tremont Street, a gust sent a scatter of orange and crimson maple leaves tumbling across my shoes. I tightened my scarf, fingers stiff from the cold, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The faint scent of candle wax and old hymnals washed over me. Inside, the stained glass windows threw muted colors across the pews. The organist played a slow, somber prelude. People murmured in low voices, adjusting coats and wiping their noses, their breath still misting from the air outside. I slipped into the very last pew, my knees brushing the polished wood. My name is Mary Ann Parker. I'm 61, a retired elementary school teacher from Dorchester, and I was about to bury my husband of 35 years, Thomas Parker. I held my handbag tightly in my lap, my knuckles white. In the front row, our daughter Emily stood up and walked toward the podium. She had flown in from New York that morning, still wearing the tailored black coat she favored for client meetings. At 32, she was everything I had worked for her to be: independent, successful, polished. Her dark hair had fallen loose from its clip, and when she looked up at the congregation, I saw the tremor in her jaw. The microphone squeaked softly as she adjusted it. "Thank you all for coming to honor my father's life," she began, her voice low but steady. I leaned forward a little, waiting for the words I had imagined in the long nights since his death, some acknowledgement of the family we had been, of the years I had raised her while Thomas built his career. My heart thumped like a slow drum. But then Emily paused, glanced toward the first row, and said, "There's someone very special I need to thank." Her eyes flickered to a woman I hadn't noticed before. She wore a deep wine-colored dress under a charcoal coat, makeup perfect, a single tissue folded neatly in her hands. A hush fell over the pews as Emily continued, "Grace Hollister has been a constant support to my father. She stood by him through his most difficult times." It felt as if the air in the church turned to ice. Heads turned, whispers darted like birds. I heard someone behind me murmur, "Who is she?" My fingers slipped on the polished wood of the pew. Emily's voice rang out clear, "Thank you, Grace, for everything you've done." The woman raised her chin, smiled softly through shimmering tears, and dabbed at the corner of her eye. I sat completely still, my body rigid, as though if I moved the whole world would tilt. Inside, a cold wave rose from my stomach to my throat. This was Thomas's funeral, my husband's farewell, and yet, in that moment, I felt myself vanish from my own life. It was just after dawn when my phone rang. The pale winter light in Dorchester crept through the blinds of my small apartment, striping the kitchen floor in gray and gold. I was standing by the counter, holding a steaming mug of Earl Grey, still in my flannel robe. The radio murmured the morning news about traffic on I-93. I remember thinking Thomas must already be halfway to his early meeting in Quincy. For 35 years, that had been our rhythm, he out the door before sunrise, me at home keeping things steady. The phone vibrated against the table, startling me. Unknown number. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse. A man's tone answered, official and hesitant. "Mrs. Parker? This is Officer Daniels with the Massachusetts State Police. Are you Thomas Parker's wife?" My fingers tightened on the mug. "Yes, is everything all right?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words do. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. There was an accident on I-93 near Quincy at approximately 6:02 a.m. Your husband's vehicle caught fire. He did not survive." I remember staring at the refrigerator door covered in old magnets and Emily's childhood drawings, as if those little scraps of color could anchor me. What are you saying?" I whispered. He's gone? The officer's voice softened. Yes, ma'am. The medical examiner says it was instantaneous. He didn't suffer. My knees gave out a little. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile. Hot tea splashed across my slippers. Oh God, Thomas, I said into the empty kitchen. I sank onto a chair, clutching the edge of the table. 35 years. In my mind, Thomas had always been like the oak tree outside our old Cambridge house, rooted, immovable, a constant in every storm. Now, with one phone call, he was ashen metal on a highway shoulder. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to breathe. Memories flickered, him raking leaves in the yard, his shirts lined up neatly in the closet, the way he'd tap his fingers on the steering wheel when Sinatra played. Later, at the funeral, that sense of unreality stayed with me. The November air at St. Paul's bit at my cheeks as I stepped out of the car. I wore the navy wool coat he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. The lining was frayed now, but I kept smoothing it down, as if that could smooth my life back into place. Inside the church I moved slowly, greeting mourners, nodding, murmuring thanks. He was such a good man, someone said, squeezing my hand. I smiled automatically, my lips stiff. Underneath it all was a single thought, repeating like a heartbeat, hold it together. Keep his dignity intact. I had done that for him all our married life, I would do it again now, even as the ground shifted under my feet. When I think back on the choices I made, it feels like paging through an old yearbook, faces, promises, and decisions frozen in time. I was 30 when the school board in Somerville offered me the chance to become the youngest principal in the district. I remember holding the letter in my hands, heart racing. That night, over dinner, I showed it to Thomas. He was cutting into his steak, his tie still perfectly knotted from the day. That's wonderful, Mary, he said at first, smiling, but then his eyes drifted back to the television. A few minutes later, as I cleared the plates, he added, You don't really want that stress, do you? I've got us covered. You can stay home, focus on the house. I'll take care of everything. He said it in the same tone he used for weather updates, factual, almost kind. And I wanted to believe it was love. I gave up the job. We moved into a grand old townhouse in Cambridge, on a street lined with sycamores. The house had exposed brick walls, a fireplace, and furniture Thomas chose from glossy catalogs. Friends would visit and say, This place looks like something from a magazine. And it did. But when they left, the room seemed to echo. He traveled more and more, closing deals, attending fundraisers. I filled my days with PTA meetings, tutoring kids from the neighborhood, cooking dinners he often missed. I started to know the UPS man's schedule better than my husband's. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen island with a cup of chamomile tea, scrolling through old lesson plans on my laptop, wondering what the classroom smelled like now, chalk dust, crayons, warm paper from the copier. Sometimes I would bring it up. Tom, maybe I could go back to teaching part-time? I'd ask while folding his shirts. He would kiss the top of my head distractedly and say, You don't need to. I told you, I've got it handled. On the outside, we were the picture of success, dinners at the Harvard Club, Christmas cards with coordinated outfits, a daughter accepted into NYU. But inside, I felt myself shrinking into a caretaker, a scheduler, the woman who made sure the dry cleaning was picked up and the guest towels were pressed. More house manager than wife. So on the day of the funeral, standing at the entrance of St. Paul's, I fell back into that familiar role. My gloved hands trembled as I greeted people, colleagues of his, old friends I barely knew. Thank you for coming, I murmured, forcing a polite smile, even as my lips felt numb from the cold. The wind knifed down Tremont Street, rattling the wreaths on the door. I adjusted my navy coat, the one he had given me for our 20th anniversary, and told myself silently, at least the farewell must be dignified. I had no idea, then, how much more undignified truths were waiting just beyond that sanctuary door. Emily's heels clicked softly against the old wooden floor as she walked to the podium. The microphone stood slightly too high for her, and I watched her fingers adjust it with a small, nervous twist. Her long brown hair had slipped from its barrette, falling over her shoulders the way it had when she was a teenager staying up late to finish school projects at our kitchen table. Seeing her there brought a sudden rush of memories, the two of us in the car at dawn driving to debate tournaments across Massachusetts, her head on my shoulder on late bus rides home, the smell of peanut butter sandwiches I packed for her. I sat forward a little in my pew, heart pounding, waiting for the words I'd dreamed of hearing at least once in my life. I want to thank my mother. She cleared her throat, voice trembling but determined. Thank you all for being here to honor my father, she began. Her gaze moved across the sea of black coats and bowed heads. I clutched my gloves in my lap until my knuckles turned white. There's someone very special I need to acknowledge, she continued after a pause. For a heartbeat I thought she was looking right at me. I imagined her saying, she was always there for both of us. But then she turned slightly toward the first row and said, clear as a bell, I want to thank Ms. Grace Hollister, the woman who stood by my father through his hardest days. A murmur rippled through the church like a sudden gust. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks. My breath caught in my throat. Grace Hollister? I'd seen her name on property deeds but had never heard my daughter speak it. She was sitting 2 pews from the front, dressed in a wine-red dress under a dark coat, hair in a perfect chignon. Her tissue trembled in her manicured hand. Slowly, almost theatrically, she stood up. Thank you, Emily, she said softly, her voice smooth but breaking just enough to sound tender. You don't know what that means to me. I sat frozen, as if the pew had turned to stone beneath me. My hands pressed flat against my knees. Inside, a cold weight dropped down through my chest. Around me, whispers flitted, isn't that the real estate agent? She's sitting with the family? I stared at my daughter's profile as she continued her speech, not looking back once at me. In that moment I felt myself tumble, not physically but inwardly, down into a silent pit. My own child, I thought, is publicly calling another woman family. I had survived years of Thomas's distance, his secrets, his polished facade. But nothing prepared me for hearing my daughter's gratitude aimed at his mistress, spoken from the pulpit at his funeral. It was like a blade sliding between my ribs, slow, deliberate, final. I lowered my head so no one would see my face. My eyes blurred. My lips moved but no sound came. All I could think, over and over, was, I raised you. I was there. How did I become invisible? I had met Grace Hollister only once, years ago, on a rainy afternoon in Cape Cod. She was the listing agent on a weathered shingle-style house Thomas had been eager to buy as a retreat. I remember standing in the airy living room, damp sand clinging to my shoes, while she handed Thomas a glossy brochure. This is a rare find, she said with a practiced smile, her silver pen poised to take notes. Thomas turned to me, eyes bright. She's good, Mary. She knows her stuff. Don't overthink it. I remember laughing lightly, thinking she was just another ambitious professional hustling for a commission. We signed the papers that day. I didn't know she'd been signing her name into my life as well. Now, years later, in St. Paul's, she was no longer the stranger with brochures. She was sitting in the front row of my husband's funeral, legs crossed neatly at the ankle, a pearl earring catching the dim church light. Her posture was calm, practiced. When Emily spoke her name, the whole room pivoted toward her as if she were the widow, not me. She raised her eyes briefly, scanning the crowd with a look that was both fragile and self-assured. I saw a flicker of something almost like triumph behind the tears she dabbed it with a tissue. People began to whisper, their heads bending together like reeds in a breeze. Isn't that the woman who sold them the Cape House? One man murmured behind me. She's sitting up front like family, another woman said. A man in a dark suit whispered, she's been around for years, I heard. Their words slithered around me, each one another sting. I gripped the pew so hard my nails left little crescent marks in the wood. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, drowning out the organ. Inside my head, I replayed Thomas's voice from years ago. She's competent. Don't be paranoid. How many times had he dismissed my questions with that same tone? I had believed him, wanted to believe him. I had told myself, "You're just tired, Mary. Don't read into things." Now, as I watched Grace shift gracefully in her seat, her manicured fingers adjusting the hem of her wine-colored dress, I felt the truth settling like a heavy coat on my shoulders. This wasn't a colleague paying her respects. This was the woman who had lived in my place, quietly, for years. I leaned slightly forward, whispering to myself so quietly only the wood of the pew could hear, "You've been erased." It wasn't just betrayal. Betrayal you can confront. This was erasure, being rewritten out of the story you built with your own hands. The life I had cooked for, cleaned for, sacrificed for was being lived by someone else in secret, and now, in front of everyone, it was being legitimized. Grace turned slightly then, perhaps sensing my stare. Our eyes met for a second. Hers were glossy, but there was no apology in them. Only a calm, measured confidence, as if she had been expecting this day, rehearsing it. I looked away first. My throat burned. Not here, I told myself. Not in front of them. I straightened my coat, smoothed my gloves, and sat up tall, because it was the only defense I had left. In that moment, sitting in the drafty sanctuary with its pealing hymn numbers and flickering candles, I understood something cold and clear. Thomas hadn't just betrayed me, he had methodically replaced me. That night, after the funeral, I drove back to the small one-bedroom apartment I was renting on Dorchester Avenue. The windshield wipers thudded back and forth, sweeping away a thin misting rain. Streetlights cast long orange streaks across the wet pavement. It was only a 20-minute drive from St. Paul's, but it felt like crossing an ocean. The townhouse in Cambridge where we had built our life had been sold the year before, to reinvest, Thomas had told me with his usual calm authority. I had signed the papers, not realizing I was signing myself out of the last home that had ever felt truly mine. When I pushed open the apartment door, the familiar faint smell of paint and old carpet greeted me. The radiator hissed softly. I dropped my purse on the small entryway table and kicked off my black pumps, my toes aching. The living room was a square box, just a beige sofa, a low coffee table, and a single wingback chair we'd moved from the Cambridge house. It was the chair where Thomas used to sit every Sunday morning with the Boston Globe folded in his lap, coffee steaming beside him. Now it sat empty, its fabric sagging a little at the arms, a quiet monument to absence. I shrugged off my coat and hung it on the back of the door. The silence pressed against my ears. In the kitchen, the fluorescent light flickered when I flipped the switch. I opened the refrigerator without thinking. There, on the middle shelf, sat a bag of French roast beans, the brand Thomas loved. He'd grind them himself every morning, humming faintly while I scrambled eggs. I had never liked the taste, it was too bitter for me. I stared at the bag for a moment, then closed the door without taking it out, as if by leaving it there I could leave a small piece of him untouched. I poured myself a glass of water and walked back to the living room, curling up on the sofa. My hands reached automatically for the old photo box I'd brought from the Cambridge house. The cardboard edges were frayed, the lid soft from years of opening and closing. Inside were hundreds of photos, some Polaroids fading at the corners. I sifted through them slowly. One picture stopped me, a young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, holding a certificate at a district banquet. Me. Next to me stood Thomas in a navy suit, smiling, his hand on my back. It had been the night I was awarded Teacher of the Year. I remembered the applause, the feeling of possibility blooming in my chest. I could still hear his voice from that night as we walked back to the car. "You don't need to keep working so hard, Mary. Quit the job. I can take care of us." He'd said it like a gift, like a promise. I had believed him. I had let go of my career, my independence, my own paycheck. Now, sitting alone in a rented apartment with funeral flowers still wilting on the counter, I felt the weight of that decision like a stone in my lap. I set the photo back in the box and closed the lid gently. "It's all buried with you now," I whispered into the room. The only reply was the hiss of the radiator and the faint hum of traffic outside. The next morning the city felt different, as if Boston itself had dimmed overnight. I buttoned my navy coat and walked slowly down Tremont Street toward the brick building with the brass plaque that read Williams and Carter, attorneys at law. The November air was sharp and dry. It smelled faintly of salt from the harbor. I kept my gloves on even inside the lobby because my fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Emily trailed a few steps behind me, her phone clutched in her hand, eyes fixed on the screen as if reading some invisible script. We rode up to the third floor in silence. The elevator walls were mirrored, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman staring back, pale, lips pressed tight, a streak of gray hair escaping her scarf. In the waiting area, a secretary in a gray sweater offered us coffee. I shook my head. Emily murmured, "I'll have tea, thank you," without looking up. When the door to the conference room opened, I felt my stomach knot. William Carter himself was waiting inside, a tall man in his mid-50s with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed glasses. His office smelled of old wood and ink, like a library after hours. On the wall behind him hung a faded print of the Massachusetts Constitution. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, slicing the mahogany table into narrow bands of light and shadow. "Mrs. Parker," he said, rising to shake my hand. "Emily." His voice was deep, deliberate, each syllable weighed before release. We sat down across from him. He opened a leather folder and adjusted his glasses. "This won't take long," he said quietly. "We are here to read Mr. Thomas Parker's last will and testament, signed on March 12, 2020. I clasped my hands tightly in my lap, my nails biting into my palms. In my mind I pictured the life we had built, our home, the Cape Cod retreat, the joint accounts, the investments we'd discussed late at night over tea. All of it, I thought, would now be passed on to Emily, our only child. That's how it should be. Carter cleared his throat and began. Pursuant to the will, the primary residence in Cambridge having been sold, the Cape Cod property, all remaining stock options, and the balances of the personal accounts, he paused, glancing at me briefly, shall be bequeathed to Ms. Grace Hollister. The words hung in the air like a dropped chandelier. For a second the room seemed to tilt. I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" I whispered. "To whom?" He repeated it slowly, kindly but firmly. "To Ms. Grace Hollister." I felt myself slide back in my chair, as if pushed off a stage I hadn't realized I was standing on. My eyes darted to Emily. She was sitting ramrod straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze fixed on the table. Not a flicker of surprise. My throat tightened. "You knew," I said, my voice trembling. "Didn't you?" Emily finally looked up, her face unreadable. "Dad had his reasons," she said softly, almost apologetically. "He told me he wanted to make things right." "Make things right?" I echoed, the words breaking like dry twigs. "After 35 years of marriage, after everything, this is making things right?" No one answered. The secretary's phone rang faintly outside. William Carter closed the folder with a quiet snap. The sound felt like a door shutting on my life. I sat there, hands trembling in my lap, feeling as though my name had been erased not just from a document but from the story of my own family. We left the attorney's office without speaking. The elevator ride down felt endless. Emily stood with her arms crossed, her phone glowing faintly in her hand. Outside, Tremont Street buzzed with traffic, but between us there was only a heavy silence. I tried to catch her eye, but she was staring at a point far off, like a passenger looking out a train window. When we reached the sidewalk, I finally whispered, "Emily, did you know about all of this?" My voice cracked on the last word. She didn't look at me. "Dad explained things to me," she said flatly, as if she'd rehearsed it. "Grace was there for him in ways you weren't." I stopped walking. "What are you saying?" She sighed, shifting her bag on her shoulder. "Grace understood Dad. You didn't." Her tone was even, but the words landed like stones. I felt my knees wobble. "I gave up my job for him." For you. I reached out a hand but let it drop. Emily glanced at her watch. I have to get back to New York tomorrow, she murmured, already turning away. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. But in that moment, I realized she wasn't defending me anymore. She was redrawing the family tree, erasing me in pencil strokes so neat they hardly left a smudge. By the time I got back to my apartment in Dorchester, my chest felt hollow. I set my purse down and stood in the middle of the living room, still in my coat, unable to sit. The November light was fading, the radiator hissed. For a long minute I just listened to the silence, as if it might answer me. Then, almost on impulse, I went to the closet and dragged out the old leather suitcase Thomas used to take on weekend trips. It still smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. I placed it on the bed and flipped the latches open with a snap. The sound echoed in the small room. Inside were some of his old files, envelopes, a few neckties rolled neatly. My fingers trembled as I sifted through them. I needed to see something, anything, to prove I hadn't been imagining the life we'd shared. Receipts from dinners, old maps of Cape Cod, a postcard from a conference in Chicago. Then my hand brushed a large cream-colored envelope with a typed label, Barnstable Property Management, Confidential. It was addressed to Grace Hollister, dated 5 years earlier. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the envelope in my lap. My heart thumped so loudly I could hear it in my ears. 5 years ago, I thought that house on the Cape was ours, a sanctuary he had built for our family. I'd decorated the guest room, stocked the kitchen with my favorite tea. I'd hosted Emily's college friends there one summer. And all along, it had been Grace's name on the correspondence. I was only a visitor in the place I had called mine. I pressed the envelope to my chest, staring at the suitcase. Was I ever more than a guest? I whispered into the empty room. The radiator hissed back. The French roast still sat untouched in the kitchen. That night, as the streetlights flickered on outside, I felt the full weight of what I had lost, not just my husband, but my daughter's loyalty, my sense of belonging, even the walls I had thought of as home. The next afternoon, unable to sit still in my apartment, I put on my old wool coat and walked back to the neighborhood in Cambridge where Thomas and I had once lived. The air smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke. I passed the sycamore trees lining our old street, their bare branches scratching at the gray sky like ink strokes. My feet led me almost automatically to the pale yellow townhouse 2 doors down, Mrs. Carol Jennings's house. Carol was 75, a widow with a garden that had always overflowed with roses and hydrangeas in summer. When Thomas traveled, she would wave to me from her porch, sometimes bringing over jars of homemade jam. She had seen everything that happened on the street. I climbed her porch steps and rang the bell. A moment later she opened the door, her silver hair pinned neatly, an apron dusted with flour around her waist. "Mary," she exclaimed, surprise flickering across her kind face. "I was so sorry to hear about Thomas." "Thank you," I murmured, stepping inside. The living room smelled of cinnamon and old wood polish. She led me to a floral sofa, poured tea into china cups. "You look tired, dear," she said gently, handing me a saucer. My hands were trembling as I set it down on my lap. I hesitated before asking, "Carol, do you remember a woman named Grace Hollister?" My voice came out softer than I intended. Carol's brow furrowed immediately. "Grace? Of course. Isn't she the one Thomas used to bring to those charity galas downtown?" She tilted her head, searching my face. "I always assumed they were a couple." "I thought you knew." I felt my stomach drop. "A couple?" I repeated faintly. "Well," she said, looking apologetic. "She was around a lot. I remember one Christmas when you were in the hospital with your arthritis flare-up. Thomas was out front putting up the holiday lights. I saw a young woman with him, handing him the clips and laughing. I thought she was some cousin or, well, later he told me it was a student volunteer helping him. I didn't question it." Her words landed like cold rain. In my memory, that Christmas had been lonely but simple, Thomas calling me from the driveway to tell me everything was under control. Now I saw it differently, Grace, standing where I should have been, helping him string the lights across the eaves of our house. I set down my tea, the china rattling against the saucer. So she's been around for at least 10 years? I whispered. Carol nodded slowly. At least. I saw her at the block party once too, when you were visiting your sister. She fit right in. I thought she was family. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Mary. I didn't mean to upset you. I managed a tight smile, though my eyes were burning. No, Carol, I said softly. You're not upsetting me. You're just confirming what I think I already knew. As I walked back down her porch steps, the cold air hit me like a slap. The houses I had once passed every day now felt foreign. The sidewalk under my boots seemed to tilt. I had spent decades choosing Thomas's suits, budgeting our savings, even dipping into my parents' nest egg to rescue his company during a bad year. And all the while, brick by brick, I had been building a future not for myself but for someone else. I paused at the curb, clutching my gloves. For the first time in years, I truly felt like a stranger on my own street, like a ghost walking through someone else's life. The next evening, after hours of pacing my small apartment, I decided to go to the storage basement beneath the building. The hallway smelled faintly of concrete dust and old paint. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air as I descended the creaking steps, each one echoing in the silence. Down here, among other tenants' boxes and forgotten furniture, I had rented a small storage cage when Thomas and I sold the Cambridge house. Most of what was left of our life together lived down here now. I flicked on the weak overhead bulb. The light swung slightly, casting shadows that made the metal cages look like prison bars. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the padlock and pushed the wire door open. Inside, stacked haphazardly, were suitcases, a stack of photo albums, and a dusty plastic bin labeled holiday. I knelt on the concrete floor, my knees aching, and began pulling things out one by one. Near the bottom I found an old cardboard box sealed with yellowing tape. My name was scrawled on top in Thomas's handwriting, Mary, Keepsakes. My heart lurched. I dragged it into the pool of light, slit the tape with my house key, and folded back the flaps. Inside lay photo envelopes, programs from concerts, postcards from Cape Cod. I picked up the first envelope and shook the prints into my lap. The top photograph stole my breath. Thomas stood there in a blue blazer, smiling broadly, his arm lightly draped over Grace Hollister's hand as they leaned across a picnic table. They looked at each other like a couple posing for an engagement shoot. Grace wore a pale sundress, her hair loose. And there, just behind them, stood Emily, only 20 then, her smile tentative, as if she wasn't sure where to look. I turned the photo over. In Thomas's neat script on the back it read, "Our little family will be official someday." My fingers went numb. The print slipped from my hand and fluttered to the concrete. For a moment all I could do was stare at it lying there like a piece of evidence. In my chest something cracked, not a physical sound, but a private shattering. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the realization that my daughter had been drawn into that family long before I even suspected. Decades of late nights, of holding the fort, of believing his words, gone, like smoke through a chimney. I stuffed the photographs back into the box and shut the lid with a snap. My hands were shaking. "How could you, Thomas?" I whispered into the cold air. No one answered. That night back in my apartment, I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter. Its glow softened the harsh edges of the room. For the first time in months, I turned on the old radio. The familiar, wistful notes of autumn leaves floated through the space, jazz we used to listen to in our early years, back when dreams still felt shared. But now the melody belonged to me alone. I closed my eyes, letting the music fill the emptiness, and whispered to my own reflection in the dark window, "Mary, it's time to live for yourself now." My voice sounded strange, like a friend's voice, like a promise. As the candle flickered and the saxophone mourned softly, I felt a small, stubborn warmth flicker inside me. For the first time in years, the apartment pulsed with my rhythm, not his. 2 mornings after finding the photographs, I wrapped a scarf around my neck, pulled on my gloves, and stepped into the chill of early December. The Boston Public Library loomed ahead of me on Boylston Street, its stone facade gray under a low winter sky. For years I had brought my students here on field trips, teaching them how to find books. Now I was here alone, not as a teacher but as a woman looking for answers. Inside, the building smelled of paper and polish. I walked past the marble lions on the grand staircase and found my way to the quiet research room. Rows of computers lined a long oak table, each with its own little green-shaded lamp. I sat down, took a deep breath, and typed Barnstable County property records into the search bar. My fingers trembled slightly as I navigated the site. It didn't take long. The screen filled with documents, deeds, transfers, tax bills. My stomach dropped when I saw Grace Hollister's name on a deed for a waterfront house in Cape Cod, purchased in June 2017, the very year Thomas had taken over the Educational Foundation Fund. I stared at the date, my pulse quickening. I remembered teasing him back then, next time you go down there for a board meeting, take me with you. He had smiled but looked away, changing the subject. At the time I'd thought nothing of it. I scribbled the address and parcel number into a small notebook I'd brought from home. The pen left shaky loops on the page. I sat back for a moment, the buzz of the fluorescent lights filling my ears, and whispered to myself, so it was true. Around me, students were bent over laptops. A man in a Red Sox cap snored softly at the next table. Life went on as if nothing had shifted. I decided it was time to call someone I could trust. In the hallway by the payphones, where the signal was better, I dialed a familiar number. Linda? It's Mary, I said when she answered. My voice wavered but steadied. Linda Brown had been a senior accountant at Thomas's company until she retired last year. We'd once shared lunches and swapped recipes. Mary, she said warmly. I heard about Thomas. I'm so sorry. How are you holding up? I've been better, I admitted. Linda, I need your help. Something's wrong with the foundation money, and with Grace. You were there when Thomas handled the accounts, weren't you? There was a pause. Then Linda's voice dropped. Meet me at my apartment tonight. Bring whatever you have. That evening, in her small kitchen in South Boston, we spread papers across her table. Linda pulled out a flash drive. I downloaded some old ledgers before I left, she said, slipping it into her laptop. Look here. Her finger traced a column of payments labeled Project Support. The money had gone to a shell company registered in Delaware, one tied to Grace Hollister. More than $400,000 had been transferred over 4 years, right when I'd been in and out of hospitals with my arthritis. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. So while I was lying in a hospital bed, he was funneling money to her? My voice was hoarse. Linda met my eyes, her expression both sad and firm. It looks that way. I'm sorry, Mary. I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and titled it Truth in bold letters. Then I began saving every document Linda forwarded to me, deeds, transfers, emails. My fingers moved quickly now, no longer shaking. I felt a strange clarity settle over me, like stepping from fog into sunlight. As I closed the laptop, I caught my reflection in the dark window above her sink. Gone was the quiet retired teacher who had sat in the back pew at a funeral. Staring back was someone new, Mary Parker, the woman preparing to write the ending to her own story. I stood up, tucking the flash drive into my purse. Thank you, Linda, I said quietly. I'm done being silent. On a pale winter morning, I walked into a glass-front office building near Copley Square clutching a thick folder labeled Truth in my own shaky handwriting. The brass plate on the door read Michelle Grant, attorney at law, financial fraud and recovery. Michelle was a tall, striking woman of 57 with salt and pepper hair pulled into a neat bun and a reputation for never backing down. Her Chicago accent lent weight to every syllable. She rose from behind her desk when I entered. "Mrs. Parker," she said, extending her hand firmly. "I've read the preliminary notes you sent me. If even half of this checks out, we have a case." Her eyes were sharp but kind. She gestured to a chair. "Sit down. Tell me everything from the beginning." For 2 hours I spoke, haltingly at first, then with gathering strength. I told her about the years of sacrifice, the Cape Cod house, the shell company, the envelopes addressed to Grace. Michelle took notes, her pen flying. Finally she set the pen down and looked at me squarely. "Mary," she said, her voice low but steady, "we're going to fight. And you're going to win." The lawsuit was filed within weeks. The docket read Parker versus Hollister in crisp black type. When I saw it for the first time, my hands trembled but my heart beat with a new steadiness. In the following months, Michelle's office became my second home. We built our case piece by piece, Linda's testimony, original bank records, photographs with handwritten captions. Linda herself came into the office one afternoon with a box of files and hugged me tightly. "We're going to make this right," she whispered. The trial opened on a gray April morning at the federal courthouse on Northern Avenue. The building's glass walls reflected the harbor. Inside, the courtroom was cool and bright, wooden benches polished to a shine. Grace sat at the defense table in a tailored navy suit, her hair perfectly arranged. She barely glanced at me. Her lawyers submitted neat binders of invoices and consulting agreements she claimed were legitimate. But Michelle was relentless. She cross-examined Grace's accountant until his answers faltered. Linda took the stand and, with quiet dignity, explained how the project support payments had been routed to Grace's company while I was hospitalized. The photographs with Thomas's handwritten note, "Our little family," were projected onto a screen. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. When my turn came, I rose slowly and walked to the witness stand. The microphone smelled faintly of metal. "Mrs. Parker," the judge said, "you may proceed." I spoke of 35 years of marriage, the nights grading papers at the kitchen table while Thomas built his company, the promises he had made and broken. My voice cracked once, but I did not stop. "I believed I was building a home for my family," I said. "In fact, I was funding a stranger's future." The judge, a dignified African-American woman with silver bracelets on her wrist, listened intently. At one point she leaned forward, her eyes meeting mine with something like sympathy. When I finished, the courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. The verdict came 3 weeks later. Grace Hollister was ordered to return all misappropriated assets, over $1 million in property and investments. The Cape Cod house, my house, was restored to my name. Grace's reputation crumbled in the press. Within months she had left Boston altogether. I never saw her again. Emily did not speak to me for nearly 3 years. She believed for a long time that I had ruined her father's legacy. But grief softens edges. When her grandfather died, she called me late one night. "Mom," she said softly, "can we talk?" We met for coffee the next morning. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You were strong," she whispered. "I just couldn't see it then." Now, on a crisp October afternoon, I stand on the porch of the Cape Cod house. The maple tree in the yard blazes red against the sky. Emily is inside making tea, the kitchen smells of cinnamon. She steps out, touches my arm. "You're still the same mom," she says with a smile. "I just finally noticed." I laugh, feeling the wind off the water. "I've always been here, sweetheart," I reply. "You just weren't looking." As the leaves drift down around us, I realize the truth: I survived. I am free, not because of what was returned to me, but because I have reclaimed myself. The house, the tree, the sea breeze are mine again, but more than that, so is my voice. Inside the Cape Cod house, the late afternoon light poured through the wide windows, turning the hardwood floors gold. Emily and I sat at the old oak table that Thomas and I had bought decades ago at a flea market in Maine. The teapot steamed between us. For the first time in years, we spoke not as mother and daughter on opposite sides of a wound, but as two women rebuilding a bridge. Emily told me about her new projects in New York, and I listened, really listened. At one point she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, a small gesture but one that said everything. We were finding our way back. Later that evening, after she had gone to bed, I stepped out onto the porch again. The sea breeze smelled of salt and pine. In the distance, the lighthouse blinked steadily against the darkening sky. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and let the quiet seep into me. For so long my life had been defined by silence, silence of compromise, of disbelief, of betrayal. Now the silence was my own, a canvas on which I could draw a new story. As I looked at the maple tree, its leaves falling like slow-motion sparks, I whispered to myself, "Mary, you made it." This house had been the scene of secrets, but now it was a sanctuary. The woman who had walked into Michelle Grant's office clutching a folder of evidence had felt small and lost. The woman standing here now felt whole. Pain had not vanished, but it had become part of the soil from which something stronger was growing. If you're watching this story, take a moment to think about the unseen sacrifices around you. Sometimes the strongest people are the quietest, sometimes justice is a long road but still worth walking. If this journey moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. And leave a comment below saying, "I'm listening," so we can stay connected and walk through these stories together. See you in the next video.